The ocean lay smooth beneath the stars. The ship slowed, then tilted. A small boat slipped into the dark.
The North Atlantic lay still beneath a pale April moon, the sea so flat it mirrored the stars. Far from any coastline, the RMS Titanic moved like a floating palace of light across the quiet water. Her 4 great funnels exhaled only faint wisps of steam, and from a distance the ship seemed less like a vessel and more like a glittering boulevard adrift between constellations. A cool breeze swept across the open decks where a few late-night passengers lingered in their heavy coats. The clocks had just passed 10 p.m., and most of the 2,200 souls on board had already retired to their cabins. Inside the grand first-class lounges, the lights were dimmed, crystal glasses stacked neatly on polished mahogany bars. Deep in steerage, Irish and Scandinavian families lay huddled together in narrow bunks, rocked by the slow, almost imperceptible rhythm of the ocean. To all of them, the voyage still felt charmed, an unsinkable dream in steel and rivets. Among those on board were the people who would later find themselves crowded together in Lifeboat No. 6. One of them was Margaret Molly Brown, 44 years old, a wealthy Denver philanthropist traveling home from a European trip. She had spent the evening chatting with friends in the saloon, known for her quick wit and strong opinions. In her cabin trunk lay silk gowns and Paris hats, but in her nature there was something sturdier, an instinct to act when others hesitated. Forward of the first-class areas, near the crew quarters, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens kept his night watch. A seasoned sailor with a reputation for gruffness, Hitchens was accustomed to long nights at the wheel. No one yet knew he would later command Lifeboat 6, his rigid caution shaping the fate of everyone in it. Elsewhere, on the crow's nest platform, 80 feet above the bow, lookout Frederick Fleet pulled his collar tight against the freezing wind. He and his mate peered across the dark sea for the ghostly silhouette of ice. The night was so still, the water so glass-like, that waves made no sound against the hull. Without binoculars, misplaced before the voyage, the men relied only on their eyes. Fleet's breath came in short clouds as he scanned the horizon, unaware that within the hour he would ring the bell in desperate warning. Down in steerage, a young Swedish mother named Anna Berglund, fictionalized here but drawn from many similar survivor accounts, settled her 2 children beneath a single wool blanket. The children whispered questions about the new life awaiting them in America. Above their heads, the steady pulse of the engines was like a lullaby, the heartbeat of a ship that felt too vast, too modern to be threatened by nature.
The air on deck smelled faintly of coal smoke and salt spray. A few gentlemen paced for exercise, collars turned up, enjoying the novelty of cold mid-ocean air. A steward tidied deck chairs under the soft glow of electric lamps, another marvel that made the Titanic seem more like a grand hotel than a seagoing vessel. Somewhere forward, a ship's dog barked once and was hushed. At 11 p.m., the ship's orchestra, having finished their evening program in the first-class lounge, packed away their instruments. Some of the musicians lingered for a quiet smoke, laughing about future performances in New York. They could not imagine that within hours they would play again, not for entertainment, but to calm the panic of hundreds. In the wireless room, Marconi operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride tapped out messages to distant Cape Race, relaying passenger telegrams. The set crackled with static, the sparks blue-white against their tired faces. Ice warnings had been arriving all afternoon from other ships farther west, but the sea tonight was so deceptively calm that the danger felt abstract, almost routine. For many passengers, that Sunday evening had been the most peaceful of the voyage. Dinner had been lavish: roast squab, lamb with mint, delicate French pastries, and afterward some had strolled the boat deck beneath the moon, remarking that the Atlantic looked as still as a pond. Several remarked how lucky they were to be aboard the largest and safest liner in the world. "She rides like a rock," someone said. Around 11:20 p.m., Molly Brown slipped into her cabin, yawning, unaware that the night's serenity was nearly over. She thought briefly of her grown children back home in Denver, of letters she intended to post from New York, and then extinguished her lamp. Somewhere below, stokers shoveled coal in the hot glow of the boiler rooms, oblivious to the stars above. If one could have hovered above the Titanic at that moment, the sight would have been mesmerizing. The ship's long, black hull slicing the moonlit silver water, her wake a pale ribbon trailing into darkness. Nothing suggested catastrophe, not the crisp sky full of stars, not the slow heartbeat of the engines, not the gentle murmur of voices behind closed stateroom doors. The illusion of invulnerability was complete. Soon, however, a speck on the horizon, hardly visible even to sharp eyes, would drift closer. It was part of an ice field sliding south from Greenland, ancient and indifferent to the marvels of Edwardian engineering. While most aboard dreamed in warm cabins, the ocean prepared its ambush in silence. At 11:35 p.m., Lookout Frederick Fleet shifted uneasily on the crow's nest platform, rubbing his gloved hands to keep them warm. The sky above him was bright with stars, but offered no moonlight on the water's surface. It was as if the sea and the sky had fused into one vast black dome, broken only by the Titanic's glittering lamps. The stillness that passengers admired earlier now worked against the lookouts. Without the usual breaking surf at an iceberg's base, there was no white splash to betray what lay ahead. 5 minutes later, Fleet leaned forward, squinting. Out of the horizon's darkness rose a smudge of something paler than the sky. It grew clearer as the ship advanced, a jagged wall of ice, ghostly white and towering more than 30 feet above the water. His pulse hammered. Fleet lunged for the bell rope and rang it 3 times. "Ice right ahead!" Then grabbed the speaking tube to the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead!" he shouted, his voice echoing down the tube. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch reacted instantly. He shouted, "Hard a starboard," to the quartermaster at the wheel, and ordered the engines reversed. The great vessel shuddered as the propellers slowed, then churned in reverse. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the Titanic began to swing to port. But momentum and mass were against them. At 11:40 p.m., the starboard bow brushed the iceberg. To passengers, it felt like little more than a drawn-out shiver underfoot, accompanied by a low rasping sound, as though a giant fingernail scraped along the hull. Few realized that beneath the surface, the ice had gouged a 300-foot series of slits across 6 watertight compartments. Down below, in the mailroom on G-deck, clerks felt the jar and heard water begin to slosh across the floor. They stared at each other in disbelief. Unsinkable ships were not supposed to leak. Forward in the boiler rooms, stokers yelled as seawater surged through torn seams in the steel plates, flooding so fast it hissed against the glowing boilers. On the boat deck above, most passengers barely stirred. Some first-class travelers who were still awake looked up from their card games and asked a steward what had happened. "Nothing at all, sir, just an ice warning," came the casual reply. Couples in the promenade felt only a mild vibration under their feet and returned to their moonlit stroll. In her cabin, Molly Brown half woke at the sensation of the ship slowing. Hearing no alarm, she decided it was probably a routine change of course and settled back under her quilt. A few decks below, Anna Berglund heard a distant thump and the curious rattle of crockery in the dining saloon. She tightened her arms around her children and whispered that it was nothing, just the engines shifting. On the bridge, however, Captain Edward Smith had arrived within minutes and was conferring grimly with Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer. The damage reports came in quickly. The forward holds were filling, water pouring in at a rate no pumps could master. Andrews made a rough calculation with his pencil, shook his head, and said the words that turned the officer's blood cold. "She can't float more than 2 hours." Smith's face hardened. He had commanded ships across the Atlantic for decades, yet nothing in his career had prepared him for the thought of losing the Titanic on her maiden voyage. At 12:05 a.m., he gave the order to uncover the lifeboats and rouse the passengers. Stewards knocked on stateroom doors, their voices polite but firm. "All passengers on deck with lifebelts." The call was met with confusion and even laughter. Few could believe a ship so immense, so newly built, could be in danger. Some women emerged in fur coats thrown over nightgowns, protesting the chill air. Men followed reluctantly, lighting cigars and joking about the inconvenience. From the boat deck came the creak of davits swinging out the wooden lifeboats. The Atlantic breeze had sharpened, biting fingers and cheeks. The sea itself remained uncannily calm, a black mirror flecked with small shards of ice glinting in the ship's lights. Fleet, relieved from lookout duty, joined other sailors in helping prepare the boats. As he glanced over the rail, he saw the iceberg receding astern, a pale mass sliding into the dark, as though nothing at all had happened. Yet below their feet, Titanic's bow was settling inch by inch. The first minutes after the collision were not by chaos, but by disbelief. The passengers carried an unshakable faith in steel and modern engineering. They expected the ship to shrug off the blow as she had shrugged off Atlantic storms. The officers on the bridge, studying the tilt of the deck and the ticking of their watches, knew better. Time had begun to run out. By midnight, the cold Atlantic wind had sharpened, knifing through coats and shawls as passengers gathered uncertainly on the sloping boat deck. The great ship still appeared stable, lights burning bright, bands striking up a soft waltz near the grand staircase to keep spirits calm. Yet a faint list to starboard betrayed the creeping flood below. Stewards moved through the clusters of passengers, urging them to don lifebelts and stay calm. Many of the men laughed or waved the instructions aside. They believed the lifeboat drill to be only precautionary. Some women hesitated to leave their cabins, fretting over the cold or the absence of husbands still dressing. The illusion of safety clung stubbornly even as the North Atlantic air grew bitter enough to sting every breath. Shortly after 12:30 a.m., Captain Smith walked the deck with quiet authority. His beard glistened with frost under the electric lamps as he ordered the lifeboats to be swung fully out and lowered to deck level. He instructed that women and children were to go first. The davit arms creaked as they swung the wooden boats outward over the dark sea, lanterns casting long shadows on the planked deck. On the port side, amidships, stood Lifeboat No. 6, a clinker-built wooden boat with room for about 65 souls. Sailors loosened its grips and fenders, while a few women in fur-trimmed coats lingered at the rail, peering down at the black water far below. The sea looked so calm, so deceptively smooth, that stepping into a narrow boat dangling on ropes above it felt more dangerous than staying aboard the vast steel liner. Margaret, or Molly Brown, awake now and fully dressed in a heavy wool coat, strode toward the boat station after urging a friend from her stateroom to follow. She had tied her lifebelt snugly over her long skirt, her face set in the determined expression that would later become legend. She noticed a sailor arguing with a gentleman who refused to be separated from his wife. Molly's tone was brisk but sympathetic as she coaxed the woman forward. "Best not to wait, dear. Get in while you can." Nearby, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens had been assigned to take charge of Lifeboat 6 once lowered. His no-nonsense manner came across as harsh, and his repeated insistence that the women hurry only added to the tension. He disliked the idea of lowering boats half-filled, yet many first-class ladies resisted leaving the warm glow of the Titanic's deck for the exposed darkness below. The confusion deepened as few passengers believed the ship could truly sink. One mother clutched her sleepy toddler and asked if she could return to fetch more blankets. A steward shook his head, pointing to the slanting deck underfoot. A young newlywed couple argued in low voices, he trying to convince his bride to follow, she refusing to step into the boat without him. Officer Second Mate Lightoller, in charge of loading on the port side, enforced the women and children only order with strict resolve. His voice cut through the wind. "Step in, ladies, quickly now." One by one, the women obeyed, skirts rustling, the ropes groaning as their weight shifted the suspended boat.
From the afterdeck, faint shouts rose. Some men urging wives to be brave, others promising to follow on the next boat. Children cried in the arms of nurses, their tears freezing on rosy cheeks. A few gentlemen tried to press forward, but were waved back by sailors who barred their path with outstretched arms. Molly Brown, already seated near the stern of number 6, watched the uncertain faces filling in around her. Beside her, a young governess clutched 2 children, murmuring lullabies in a trembling voice. A well-dressed woman sat stiffly upright, shivering despite a fur stole. The lantern at the bow flickered, throwing each expression into fleeting relief. Above them, the band had shifted to a sprightlier tune, Alexander's ragtime band, someone thought, playing as if to deny the creeping dread. The lively strains floated across the deck, incongruous against the sight of lifeboats swaying over the black water. At 12:55 a.m., Lightoller called out to lower away. With fewer than 30 aboard, less than half her capacity, Lifeboat No. 6 began its descent. The thick manila ropes hissed through the pulleys as sailors braced gloved hands on the winches. The women clutched the gunwales and each other, holding their breath as the boat wobbled downward toward the Atlantic that glistened like onyx under the ship's electric glare. The bow of the Titanic loomed above them like a towering cliff of riveted steel, lights shining in rows of windows, funnels outlined against a field of stars. Passengers leaning over the rail waved or called farewells. No one suspected that in a little over an hour that proud bow would be beneath the sea. When the boat reached the waterline, sailors unhooked the falls and pushed the craft a few yards clear of the ship's side. The cold hit harder here, the breeze unobstructed, the smell of coal smoke replaced by the raw scent of salt and ice. A hush fell over the women as they looked back up at the brightly lit liner, feeling as though they had stepped out of civilization into a fragile shell adrift on endless blackness. Lifeboat 6 rocked gently, oars resting in their locks, waiting for orders. Hitchens barked for 2 crewmen to man the forward oars and instructed the women to stay seated and keep still. Above them, more boats were being filled, some reluctantly, some with frantic haste, as the list of the ship grew more obvious. For those now afloat, the sense of separation from the Titanic was profound. A few whispered prayers, others stared upward as if unwilling to believe they had truly left the safety of the great ship. Molly Brown's eyes lingered on the promenade deck, where figures still moved unconcerned in the glow of electric lamps. She muttered under her breath, "They'll wish they'd come sooner." In that moment, as the lifeboat drifted a short distance from the hull, the women could still hear the strains of music and occasional bursts of laughter from the decks above. The scene was surreal, an ocean liner aglow like a floating city, serenading the darkness, while its first handful of passengers bobbed on the frigid sea below.
The sea around Lifeboat No. 6 was eerily calm, its surface broken only by fragments of drift ice that knocked softly against the hull. The lantern at the bow cast a trembling yellow path across black water as the women huddled shoulder to shoulder beneath wool shawls and borrowed blankets. Behind them, the Titanic still towered, a colossal silhouette crowned in electric light, her 4 funnels exhaling thin ghosts of steam into the frozen sky. Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, standing stiff at the tiller, gripped the handle as though steering through stormy seas instead of this classy plane. His narrow eyes kept darting toward the mothership. "Keep her steady," he muttered to the 2 sailors at the oars. He had no intention of lingering too near the liner. Beside the stern thwart, Molly Brown leaned slightly forward, her gloved hands gripping the gunwale. The bitter wind reddened her cheeks but sharpened her resolve. She could see clusters of passengers leaning over Titanic's rails, faces pale under the lights, still not believing danger was real. From the upper deck floated the faint sound of the band's instruments, slow chords now replacing ragtime, as if the musicians sensed the mood had changed. The lifeboat rocked gently on small swells. Every creak of oarlock or slap of water sounded magnified in the night. The women exchanged whispers. Some wondered aloud if they ought to row back to pick up more people. Others shivered in silence, eyes fixed on the giant vessel as if hypnotized. Hitchens snapped at them to hush. "We'll not be going back. We'll get sucked under when she goes," he said sharply. The words startled the passengers. Most had not considered the thought that the Titanic might actually founder. Molly Brown's gaze hardened. She disliked his tone and the fear it sowed among the women. Time passed in slow, freezing minutes. Frost formed along the gunwales. Every breath showed white in the lantern glow. Over the water drifted a muffled chorus of calls from the liner, stewards herding reluctant passengers toward the boats, men calling encouragement to wives, occasional bursts of orders from the officers. At around 1:30 a.m., a hush rippled through those in Lifeboat 6 as the Titanic's bow settled noticeably lower. The forward well deck seemed to kiss the Atlantic. A shimmer of icy water reflected the lights on the ship's skin. From where they drifted a few hundred yards out, the people in the boat could hear the hiss of sea rushing into vents and open hatches. The band's music changed again, slower, solemn hymns that floated across the water, mingling with the sounds of shouted orders and the rhythmic creak of davits lowering more boats. The women in number 6 clutched each other's hands as the ship's stern lifted slightly, an ominous sign that her bow compartments were flooding fast. Anna Berglund's children whimpered against her coat, too cold to cry aloud. Molly Brown reached to adjust a blanket around them, murmuring comfort. A thin frost had already crusted the edges of their lifebelts. As the clock neared 2 a.m., the ship's forward decks were awash. The massive name Titanic on her bow dipped close to the sea, letters glinting eerily in the last of the ship's electric glow.
The stern lifted higher, deck chairs sliding toward the rail with soft thuds. From the lifeboat, they could see tiny human figures clinging to the slanting rails, silhouetted against rows of portholes still shining like distant candles. Suddenly, a roar unlike anything they had heard before split the night, the deep grinding thunder of 1,000,000 tons of steel tearing as the Titanic's forward funnel collapsed, smashing into the water and sending up a geyser of foam. The wave rocked Lifeboat 6 violently, nearly unseating several passengers. Hitchens shouted at the women to keep low as he fought to keep the boat head-on into the swell. The sound was followed by cries that pierced the darkness. Hundreds of voices rose together from the freezing sea as the Titanic's stern lifted steeper, her lights flickering and dying one by one until only the stars remained. The women covered their ears, some sobbing openly, others frozen in mute horror. Molly Brown gripped the oar handle and whispered through clenched teeth, "God help them all." At 2:20 a.m., with a final groan like a wounded leviathan, the great liner's stern reared nearly upright, then slid swiftly beneath the Atlantic. The sea closed over her with a hiss and a rush, leaving only scattered wreckage, the pale glow of the stars, and the screams of those still struggling in the water. For a long moment, even the waves seemed to pause. The survivors in Lifeboat 6 stared at the empty patch of sea where the largest ship in the world had stood minutes before. The lantern flame flickered wildly in the breeze, illuminating faces drawn tight with shock. All around them came the desperate cries of hundreds calling for rescue. Molly Brown turned on Hitchens, urging that they row back to pick up as many as they could. He refused, warning that the drowning would swamp their boat. The argument grew sharp, voices carrying across the dark water, until Brown seized an oar herself and began to row, setting an example that shamed others into helping. Still, the boat remained too far to save those whose voices were already fading into the cold. Gradually the cries thinned, one after another falling silent, until only the slap of water and the occasional crack of floating debris against the lifeboat's hull broke the vast, pitiless stillness of the Atlantic night.
The sea had swallowed the Titanic, and with her departure came a silence so immense it seemed to engulf the world. The women in Lifeboat No. 6 sat motionless, listening for echoes that no longer came. Only the lap of water against the planks and the groan of oarlocks disturbed the stillness. Above them, the stars glittered mercilessly, hard and bright against the inky void. The Atlantic night was colder now. Without the bulk of the liner blocking the wind, the air sliced across faces and stung bare hands. Frost gathered on coats, crusting collars and veils with a pale sheen. Breath rose in clouds that froze into crystals on the edges of scarves. Some women shivered uncontrollably. Others swayed in a trance of exhaustion, rocking gently as if to lull themselves into endurance. At the stern, Robert Hitchens remained a grim silhouette, his voice sharp whenever someone shifted or whimpered too loudly. He warned that rowing back would be folly, repeating it like a shield against guilt. "Keep her steady into the wind. That's all we can do," he barked. His tone carried authority, but it also betrayed fear. The sea might look calm, but in his mind the weight of catastrophe loomed with every passing second. Molly Brown, however, would not allow despair to sink the boat before the sea did. She urged the women to take turns at the oars to keep warm. "Pull a stroke or two. It will save your fingers from freezing," she insisted. Some obeyed, awkwardly gripping the heavy wooden shafts, their movements clumsy but determined. Brown herself took an oar, her rings glinting in the lantern light as she rowed with fierce rhythm. Her energy seemed inexhaustible, born not from strength alone, but from the conviction that idleness meant death. Around her faces were pale, and lips cracked with cold.
Anna Berglund held her children tight, murmuring prayers in Swedish, their small bodies pressed against her to capture what warmth she could. The children whimpered at intervals, but then drifted into uneasy sleep, their breaths shallow, their hair damp with frost. Brown leaned toward the young mother, whispering encouragement, promising that dawn would come soon. Occasionally, across the dark expanse, a shout or the creak of another boat's oars carried through the still air. They were not alone, though each craft was adrift like an isolated island. Some women strained their eyes for the glow of lanterns on other lifeboats, comforted by the sight of faint pinpricks scattered across the water. Yet the distances were vast, the dark overwhelming. The enormity of the Atlantic pressed down on them, reminding each survivor of how small and fragile their refuge truly was. Hours crawled by. To mark time was impossible. Fatigue blurred minutes into hours, hours into a gray numbness. Several passengers slumped forward in semi-consciousness, their heads resting on neighbors' shoulders. Teeth chattered in unison like a ghastly percussion. Now and then the boat rocked as ice fragments knocked against it, the sound like glass breaking in the night. Molly Brown raised her voice again when despair threatened to crush them. "Don't give in now. Think of those waiting for us in New York. Think of your families." Her words gave shape to endurance, a reminder that the world still existed beyond this frozen void. Even the quarrels with Hitchens became a strange lifeline, her defiance proving that willpower still lived among them. By 3:30 a.m., the eastern sky began to shift. At first, it was only a faint paling of the stars, a suggestion that night could not last forever. Slowly, a band of gray crept along the horizon, widening until the edge of the sea took form. The women stirred from their stupor, stiff necks turning toward that promise of dawn. One of the children whimpered, "The sun is coming?" And the whisper passed like a fragile blessing from row to row. The ocean revealed itself as littered with debris, deck chairs, broken planks, floating trunks, all gilded by the first light. The sight renewed sorrow, for each relic spoke of the ship that had been their home hours earlier. But with daylight also came hope. The world was visible again, and in the distance something glimmered. At 4 a.m., a lookout in the lifeboat pointed to the east. There, faint but distinct, were lights, steady, deliberate, belonging to no star. Gasps spread among the women. The RMS Carpathia, having steamed full speed through the night, was arriving at last. The news electrified the survivors. Some wept with relief, others clasped hands in silent gratitude. Molly Brown urged the women to row harder toward the lights, desperate to shorten the distance between salvation and their frail craft. Even Hitchens, though muttering about his authority, allowed the oars to pull with new vigor. Every splash of wood and water was an act of defiance against despair. As the Carpathia drew nearer, her silhouette took form, smaller than Titanic, but to these eyes a fortress of hope. The rising sun painted her hull in tones of bronze and rose, and from her funnel poured a plume of smoke, black against the dawn. At last, sailors on Carpathia's deck shouted across the gap, their voices carried by the morning air. Ropes were thrown, ladders lowered. One by one, stiff and half-frozen passengers of Lifeboat No. 6 were lifted toward safety. Hands roughened by rope and salt grasped delicate fingers numbed by frost. Warm blankets were pressed around shivering shoulders, cups of broth offered to lips that could barely sip. Molly Brown, still unyielding, insisted that others be tended before her. Hitchens slumped silent, his authority dissolving in the presence of a real ship once more.
The survivors clutched each other in disbelief as they crossed the threshold from nightmare into rescue. For the first time in hours, the women of Lifeboat 6 allowed themselves to breathe freely. Yet their eyes still carried the reflection of the vanished liner and the silence of those who would never see this dawn.
A hush lingered on the Carpathia's decks as the survivors were wrapped in blankets and offered cups of steaming coffee. Dawn revealed a pale, wintry Atlantic, waves gentle yet glittering with shards of drifting ice. The horizon stretched endlessly, indifferent to the sorrow it held. For those rescued from Lifeboat No. 6, the solid deck beneath their feet felt almost unreal, as though they had stepped from one dream into another. Many passengers sank onto benches, staring blankly at nothing. Others began to weep, not the frantic cries of terror from the night before, but soft, exhausted sobs that came in waves as memory returned. Children clung to mothers who could hardly speak, their lips still numb from hours in the cold. Stewards moved quietly among them with hot broth, urging them to sip, their faces grave with compassion. Molly Brown refused to rest. Her natural energy surged once more as she organized the distribution of spare clothes and blankets gathered from Carpathia's passengers. She pressed a wool coat around a shivering boy, adjusted a scarf for a woman too numb to do it herself, and scolded the dazed into drinking warm tea. Witnesses later remembered her as a whirlwind of practicality, stern yet kind, unwilling to let despair claim those who had been spared the sea. Robert Hitchens kept to himself near the rail, staring into the waves. The quarrels from the night echoed in his mind, his refusal to return toward the cries, his sharp words to the women. Now, in the safety of daylight, he looked smaller, shoulders hunched as though the weight of guilt had settled there. No one spoke to him at first. Grief and exhaustion left little room for blame, though whispers would follow in the days to come. Among the rescued was Anna Berglund, the Swedish mother, who sat with both children curled under a borrowed blanket. She kept murmuring thanks to anyone who passed by, tears of relief freezing on her lashes. Her children slept at last, their tiny hands still clenched in fists, unwilling to let go of her coat. By mid-morning, the Carpathia had taken aboard all who could be saved, just over 700 survivors. The crew read out the grim tally, more than 1,500 souls lost to the freezing water. A collective shudder passed through the gathered crowd. The numbers were too immense to fully grasp. Some covered their faces, others simply stared at the sea, as if expecting to glimpse the vanished liner rising again from the depths. Throughout that day and the 2 days of steaming westward to New York, the survivors of Lifeboat 6 often clustered together at the rail. They spoke little. Sometimes Molly Brown would point out a gull or a distant ship to distract the children, her voice gentle but edged with sadness. At night, the ocean was quiet again, as though the tragedy had been swallowed whole, leaving only starlight and the distant churn of Carpathia's engines. In private moments, each remembered the sounds of the sinking, the distant band playing hymns, the final roar as the Titanic broke apart, the fading chorus of voices calling for help. Those echoes lingered long after the sea's surface had closed. When the Carpathia finally approached New York Harbor on April 18th, thousands lined the piers in rain and mist to welcome the battered survivors. Journalists scrambled for stories, but many passengers turned away, shielding their faces from the press cameras. They carried memories too raw to be displayed. Molly Brown, however, stepped forward to speak for those still trembling.
She praised the bravery of women and crew alike, called for a relief fund for the destitute steerage survivors, and became, almost unwillingly, a heroine in headlines as the unsinkable Mrs. Brown. Her resolve during the long night on the water would become part of Titanic's enduring legend. As for Hitchens, he faced questions about his conduct in Lifeboat 6. Some accused him of cowardice, others argued he had acted prudently to prevent their boat from capsizing. History would never quite settle the debate, but even those who criticized him conceded that he had kept them alive. The memory of that April night endured in every survivor's life like a scar beneath the skin. They returned to homes and families changed forever, haunted by the sound of voices across the water that no rescue had reached. Years later, survivors would recall the sight that stayed with them most vividly, the first soft light of dawn revealing the wide, empty sea scattered with fragments of a vanished ship, and the knowledge that their lives had been spared by chance, by fate, by the space of a few feet in a lifeboat. The ocean itself remained silent. It gave no explanation, no comfort, only the endless rhythm of waves, as it had before, and would again long after ships and passengers and whole histories passed from its surface. In telling their story, we remember not only the grandeur of a famous liner, but the fragile courage of those who endured the night. Women rowing against the cold to keep blood flowing, mothers soothing frightened children, strangers sharing blankets and hope. Lifeboat No. 6 became their small ark on a frozen black sea, bearing witness to loss and survival alike.